Last week's Mustang Monday met with a few disappointments and setbacks. This week started out strong and met with a few disappointments and setbacks. Still managed to get quite a bit of stuff accomplished. I got some windows cleaned up, waiting on the weather stripping, and then those will go in. So the entire driver's side is pretty much ready to put in window-wise as soon as the weather stripping comes in. I hadn't originally planned on reusing these windows. The only reason I kept them around was just for comparison, make sure that when I bought the reproduction windows to replace them, that they were the right parts and they had all the components and stuff. So they've been sitting up in the attic gathering dust. Brought them down, unwrapped them, gave them a good cleaning to make sure that they were serviceable. The only thing I'm really concerned about is making sure that there's no cracks or anything like that that might make them unsafe or, compromised so that they can't actually do what windows are supposed to do. They looked like they were in reasonably good shape, so I taped them up and papered them up and just cleaned them up as best I could. Grinder, wire wheel, whatever it took to get the pitting and rust off, and then shot a can of rattle can black enamel after some primer. The pitting in the window surrounds was a little more significant on this window, so I had to be a little more aggressive with the sanding disc, which in turn meant that I then needed to go over with some finer grit sandpaper to remove the scratches. So they didn't look terrible. Because somehow a little bit of spray paint is going to make something not look terrible, right? I took the vent windows apart, bagged up all the hardware, just inspected them to make sure that they were still in good shape or good enough shape to paint, and then did the same thing. Used the wire wheel, clean them up a little bit, shot a coat of primer, shot a coat of paint. I got the brake brackets in early last week and lined them up, just put them on the car and made sure that they fit appropriately and they were what I needed. When I was confident that they were, I gave them a couple of coats of paint, and that was when I had my first setback for this week, which was I cut the bearings off of the axle. The brackets slide between the bearings and the hub, and when I cut the bearings off, I expected I was just going to be able to go to the local parts store and get new bearings, and not so much. So I had to order those online. They're not here yet. That was disappointment number one. Not that big of a deal. So I got the brackets in, looked over the instructions for them. Pretty comprehensive instructions, actually. So far, I'm pretty impressed with this company. They made specific mention to test fit everything before you painted them or attached them in any way, shape, or form. So if you needed to return them, you could. So I did that. Once I knew they fit, I cleaned them up as best I could, started painting, and then I found disappointment number two. The brackets had sat overnight in the garage, and it was pretty cold, so when I tried to put primer on them, I didn't let them warm up enough, and for the most part, I ended up with a great big mess of paint, and I had to sand it all off and repaint it eventually, but I did that later. And while I was messing with the brake parts, I got the calipers and brackets and gave them a couple coats of the same gloss black enamel. I cut the bearing and the retaining ring off of each one of the axles and set the pieces aside so that I had a comparison when I went out shopping for new brackets or new bearings. I pulled the hub off of the driver's side, turned it around, and used it as a makeshift slide hammer to try and pull the axle out. Turns out it worked pretty well. Was able to get the axle out, and then I did the same thing to this axle that I did to the other one. If you do this, be very careful you don't pull the car off the jack stands. That would be bad. And I cut the bearings off without damaging the backing plates because those things are expensive. Also moved some parts around. Like I said before, I'm working with 2 or 3 different motors at the moment. This particular motor that I have here in the garage, I had turned the headers around to test it for the turbo, and I needed to turn them back around. There's no exhaust manifold gaskets on it yet. Put the 4-barrel carburetor and the other manifold on. Again, no gaskets, so those have to come off. Basically right now I'm just trying to find places to store parts so that I have room to work while I'm moving things around. My attic and my garage floor are littered with parts for Ford 302 motors, and on top of that I've begged, borrowed, and stealed some of the parts from my father, who also has a 302 engine in a car out there. My first step is I'm going to try and use this motor if I can. I'm going to start swapping all of the parts necessary to get it in the car. I've got to function test it first, but I'm going to, because I don't have a motor stand for that, I'm going to put it in the car and see what happens. Easy enough to pull out when it doesn't work, or if it doesn't work. I got distracted while I was working on the motor and picked up the drive shaft from my father's 46 that still had the T5 transmission yoke attached to it. Pressed out the needle bearings, or the universal, and checked, make sure I had all the needle bearings, and then put it all back together and wrapped it up in duct tape so I can send this back out to the river and get it out of my garage. I pulled the windshield wiper motor assembly and arms, gave that a little bit of a check to make sure that it was still appropriately cleaned up, and it looks like it still functions. I tested it before I stored it, so unless it's gone bad between then and now, it should still function fine. Then I crawled up underneath the dash to get measurement checks on hardware. I'm not going to order factory spec hardware for this thing. It's not a concourse restoration by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm not really all that concerned about getting the exact this particular stuff. I've got it at the local hardware store. Hopefully I can get everything else caught up this week once I get all the parts in and really start putting parts on the next week. I would like to have all of the windows in and all the weather stripping taken care of, trunk bolted down, transmission together, ready to roll, and start working on getting the engine ready to function test. Then it'll be onto the wiring harness and brake lines. Have a great week.